They say you can feel it when someone's watching you. That little prickle at the back of your neck, like a whisper your subconscious hears before you do. It's an instinct, ancient and primal. My friend Rachel didn't believe in that sort of thing, at least, not until it started happening to her. Rachel's always been independent, the kind of woman who prided herself on late nights at the office and walking home without a second thought. The town we lived in, Meadowbrook, wasn't exactly crime-ridden. Just your typical American suburb with quiet streets, a diner that never closed, and everyone knowing a little too much about everyone else's business. But everything changed on a cold November night. Rachel had stayed late at work again, her boss dumping last-minute revisions on her desk like they had no idea she had a life outside the office. By the time she stepped out of the building, the streets were almost empty, the few cars left humming under the glow of streetlights. She was tired, frustrated, but not nervous. Why should she be? Meadowbrook was safe. At first, she didn't notice him. She was halfway down the main street when the sound of footsteps registered, soft but deliberate, echoing behind her. She glanced back, casual, like someone might if they dropped something and wanted to make sure no one saw. There was a man. Mid-30s, maybe older, dressed in a hooded sweatshirt and jeans. Nothing unusual, except, he was too far back for their paths to have crossed earlier. If he'd been behind her from the start, she would have noticed, right? Rachel shook it off and kept walking. The logical part of her brain insisted it was nothing. Lots of people walked home from work this time of night. Still, she picked up her pace, and as she did, the footsteps behind her quickened too. She turned the next corner sharply, ducking into a smaller street where the lights were dimmer. Meadowbrook's charm didn't extend to alleyways. But that was the quickest route home, and Rachel was too tired to take the long way. When she glanced back this time, he was closer. Her heartbeat kicked up, though she told herself she was being ridiculous. It wasn't until she reached her building and fumbled with her keys that she realized how fast she'd been walking. She shoved the door open and slipped inside, letting it close behind her with a dull thud. For a moment, she stood there, her chest heaving as she tried to calm down. Then curiosity got the better of her. She peered through the glass window in the door, expecting to see an empty street. He was there. The man stood just outside the pool of light from the nearest street lamp, far enough back that his features were hidden, but close enough that she could see the pale blur of his face. He wasn't moving. He was just, standing there, like he was waiting for something. Rachel told herself it didn't mean anything. He probably lived nearby. Maybe he was drunk, or lost. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, locked the door behind her, and spent the night convincing herself she was overreacting. But then it happened again. And again. A few nights later, Rachel called me. I remember how her voice sounded over the phone, strained, like she was trying to downplay something serious. "I think someone's following me," she said. I could hear her pacing, the clinking of her coffee mug as she set it down too hard. I tried to reassure her. "It's probably just a coincidence. You're walking home around the same time every night. People have routines, you know." She didn't sound convinced. "Yeah, but I've started changing my route. Last night I took the long way, went through that park by 7th Street. He was there, too. That got my attention." "The same guy?" "I'm pretty sure. Hooded sweatshirt, kind of lanky. He doesn't get close enough for me to see his face, but it feels like. I don't know, like he's watching me." "Have you called the cops?" She hesitated. "And tell them what? Some guys walking behind me on public streets? They're not going to do anything unless something happens." I hated that she was probably right. A week went by. Rachel started texting me whenever she got home, little check-ins that became a kind of ritual. "Made it," she'd write. Or just, "home." It became the norm, until one night, she didn't text. I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. At first, I figured her phone had died. But as the hours ticked by, unease twisted in my gut. I didn't want to overreact, but something felt wrong. Finally, around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was her. Except, it wasn't. The message was simple: "Don't worry. She's safe with me now." My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, my pulse pounding in my ears. It was Rachel's number, but the words weren't hers. When I finally got a hold of her the next day, her voice was hoarse, like she'd been crying. She apologized for scaring me, said her phone had been stolen, that the message was some sick joke. But something about the way she said it didn't sit right with me. She was holding something back. And then she told me about the note. That morning, Rachel had found a piece of paper slipped under her door. It was folded in half, plain and unmarked, except for the words written inside, "I see you." Rachel tried to act like everything was normal after the note, but I could tell it rattled her. She wasn't the kind of person to scare easily. She had this steel in her, like she could handle anything the world threw at her. But this was different. The note wasn't just creepy, it was invasive. Someone had been close enough to her apartment to slip it under her door. That meant whoever was following her knew where she lived. She called the building manager the next day, asking about security cameras, but the answer was exactly what we both expected: there weren't any. Meadowbrook wasn't the kind of town where people worried about that kind of thing. "Nothing ever happens here," the guy told her, like he thought that would be reassuring. For a few days, things were quiet. Rachel went about her routine, always on edge but determined not to let fear run her life. She stopped walking home, started taking cabs instead, and I thought maybe that would be enough to shake this guy off. But then the second note showed up. This one was taped to her door. She sent me a picture of it, and I'll never forget the way the words looked, scrawled in messy, uneven handwriting. "Why don't you smile more?" Something about it made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the words, it was the implication that this person wasn't just watching her, they were studying her, close enough to notice her expressions, her moods. Rachel called me that night, her voice trembling with frustration. "What the hell am I supposed to do, huh? Call the cops and say what? Hey, some guy keeps leaving me creepy notes. They'll laugh me out of the station." "I think you should file a report anyway," I told her. "At least get it on record." But Rachel wasn't convinced. "Unless they catch him in the act, it doesn't matter." She wasn't wrong, but it didn't make me feel any better. Then came the third message. This time, it wasn't a note. It was a photograph. She found it the next morning, tucked under her door again. Rachel froze when she picked it up, her heart racing as she unfolded the paper. The image was grainy and slightly overexposed, but there was no mistaking what it showed: her, sitting at her desk at work. She hadn't noticed anyone taking her picture that day. Why would she? Her office was on the ground floor, with big windows facing the street. People walked by all the time. But seeing herself like that, frozen in the middle of some mundane moment, sent chills down her spine. That was when she finally went to the police. I went with her to the station, sitting beside her in the waiting room as she explained everything to the officer at the front desk. He listened, nodding in all the right places, but I could tell he wasn't taking it seriously. When Rachel showed him the photo, he frowned and said, "It's creepy, but it's not illegal to take pictures of someone in public." "What about the notes?" Rachel pressed. "And the fact that he knows where I live?" The officer leaned back in his chair, sighing like this whole thing was a waste of his time. "Look, Ms. Davis, we'll file a report, and if you see this guy again or get any more messages, give us a call. But without any evidence that he's threatening you or planning to hurt you, there's not much we can do." It was the same thing she'd been afraid of hearing. We left the station feeling worse than before. That night, I stayed over at her apartment. Rachel wasn't the type to ask for help, but I insisted. The idea of her being alone with that guy out there, it made my skin crawl. I remember sitting in her tiny living room, the silence stretching out between us, neither of us saying what we were really thinking. Around midnight, just as we were starting to nod off, there was a noise outside the window. A soft scraping sound, like something sharp being dragged across the glass. We froze, exchanging a look that said, "Did you hear that?" Rachel grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. Meanwhile, I crept to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The blinds were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of something, a shadow, shifting just on the other side. "Someone's outside," Rachel whispered into the phone, her voice barely audible. "I think it's him." The operator told her to stay inside, to lock the doors and wait for the police. But before they even arrived, the noise stopped. By the time the cops got there, the man was gone. All they found was a single deep scratch running down the length of the windowpane, like he'd wanted to leave a mark. A reminder that he'd been there. The next day, Rachel decided to take some time off work. She told herself it was just to clear her head, but I knew the real reason: she was terrified to leave the apartment. And honestly, I didn't blame her. But the maniac wasn't done. The messages didn't stop. In fact, they were about to get worse. Rachel spent the next few days holed up in her apartment. She barely ate, barely slept. She kept her blinds closed, her doors bolted, and every light in her tiny space blazing well into the night. I came over as often as I could, but even I couldn't shake the unease that crept in whenever I sat in her living room, listening to the sounds of the street outside. Every passing car, every burst of laughter from someone walking by felt wrong, like it didn't belong in the silence that seemed to have wrapped itself around her life. And then, the maniac escalated. The fourth message arrived on a Thursday. Rachel found it taped to her bathroom mirror. That's right, asterisk inside asterisk her locked apartment. When she called me, she was almost hysterical. "How did he get in?" she kept asking, over and over again. "I locked the door. I locked it. I checked the locks twice." I rushed over, my own fear bubbling beneath the surface as I tried to stay calm for her sake. The note was still there when I arrived, taped neatly to the glass like it had been placed with care. It read, "I'm closer than you think." The police came, but as usual, they couldn't find anything. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints on the mirror or the note. They asked if Rachel might have forgotten to lock the door, but I knew better. She was obsessively careful about it ever since the first note showed up. The officers were polite but dismissive, clearly thinking she was just imagining things or blowing them out of proportion. "We'll keep an eye on the area," one of them said, handing her a case number like it was some kind of consolation prize. After they left, Rachel sank into the couch, her head in her hands. "I'm going crazy, aren't I?" she muttered. "That's what they think. That I'm losing my mind." "You're not crazy," I said firmly. But deep down, even I was starting to wonder how this guy was pulling it off. No forced entry. No cameras catching him. It didn't make sense. That night, Rachel insisted I stay over again. She didn't want to be alone, and honestly, I didn't want to leave her. We double-checked the locks on the door and windows, and I even slid a chair under the doorknob for good measure. It felt silly, like we were kids playing make-believe, but it made her feel a little safer, and that was all that mattered. We stayed up late watching bad TV, the sound turned low so we could hear any noises outside. Around 2 a.m., Rachel finally dozed off on the couch. I covered her with a blanket and sat there, fighting to keep my own eyes open. And then, I heard it. A soft thud, followed by a faint creak, like weight shifting on the wooden floor. My heart lurched into my throat as I looked around the room, every shadow suddenly too deep, too still. I glanced at Rachel, who was still asleep, then reached for my phone. I was just about to call the cops when I saw it. The bathroom door was open. We'd closed it earlier, I was sure of it. My stomach twisted as I stood, every step toward the doorway feeling heavier than the last. I peered inside, my fingers trembling as I flicked on the light. At first, I didn't see anything. The bathroom looked exactly the way it always did. But then I saw the sink. There, in the basin, was another message. It wasn't a note this time. It was scrawled directly onto the porcelain, smeared in what looked like lipstick or maybe marker. 3 words, dripping down toward the drain, "I'm watching you." I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. I ran to Rachel, shaking her awake. She bolted upright, panic in her eyes as I told her what I'd found. She didn't ask questions, she just grabbed her phone and called the cops. When they arrived, they searched the entire apartment again, but as usual, they found nothing. No sign of anyone breaking in, no evidence of how the message had been written. One of the officers suggested that maybe Rachel had done it herself, unthinkingly, in some kind of stress-induced daze. The implication was clear, they thought she was cracking under the pressure. After that, Rachel didn't just stay home, she barely left her bedroom. I brought her groceries, checked in on her every day, and tried to convince her to stay with me for a while, but she wouldn't budge. "If I leave, he wins," she said, her voice hollow. "And what's to stop him from following me somewhere else?" Her paranoia was growing, and I couldn't blame her. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows sent her into a panic. She started keeping a knife by her bedside, and I knew she was barely sleeping. I thought things couldn't get any worse. I was wrong. The 5th message wasn't just a note or a photo. It was personal. Rachel called me late one night, her voice so frantic I could barely understand her. "It's my shirt," she kept saying. "He has my shirt." When I got to her apartment, she was sitting on the floor, clutching a crumpled piece of paper in one hand. In the other, she held a tattered t-shirt, the one she told me she lost weeks ago. The paper had only one word written on it, "Mine." I felt sick. Somehow, this guy had been inside her apartment long enough to take something, keep it, and then return it as some kind of twisted trophy. He wasn't just watching her anymore. He was toying with her, playing a game only he understood. We didn't know it then, but the game was far from over. It was just beginning. By now, Rachel was barely holding it together. Her apartment, once tidy and filled with personal touches, had become a prison. The blinds were permanently drawn, the windows taped shut, and the locks on her door double-checked a dozen times a day. She even pushed her couch against the door at night, as if that would keep him out. But the worst part wasn't the fear, it was the not knowing. The messages kept coming, each one more invasive than the last, but there was never any sign of how. No broken locks, no open windows, nothing left behind except the suffocating sense that he was always a step ahead. I couldn't take it anymore. Watching Rachel unravel, feeling powerless to help, it was eating me alive. That's when I came up with the idea to set a trap. "Let me stay over again," I told her one evening, trying to keep my voice steady. "But this time, we'll be ready for him." Rachel looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "How? The cops don't even believe me. What are we supposed to do?" "We don't need the cops," I said. "We'll catch him ourselves. Cameras, locks, whatever it takes. If he's getting in, we'll figure out how." She hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of her coffee mug so tightly I thought it might crack. "What if it doesn't work?" she whispered. "It will," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it. But we had to try something. The plan was simple. I brought over a couple of small motion-activated cameras, the kind people use as baby monitors or pet trackers. They weren't high-tech, but they'd do the job. I set one up in the living room, aimed at the front door, and another in her bedroom. Rachel didn't love the idea of being filmed while she slept, but I convinced her it was necessary. If he was getting in, we'd see it. For extra precaution, I wedged a chair under the front doorknob and balanced an empty glass bottle on the chair's edge. If the door moved, the bottle would fall. It felt almost laughable, like we were characters in some cheap horror movie, but I told myself it was better than doing nothing. That night, we waited. Rachel stayed on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes glued to the TV even though I could tell she wasn't paying attention. I sat beside her, trying to stay awake, but the hours dragged on, and soon the silence was thick enough to choke on. At some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was because of the sound, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. A faint click, like metal scraping against metal. My eyes snapped open, and for a second, I couldn't tell if I'd imagined it. But then I saw Rachel, wide awake and staring at the door, her face pale as a sheet. "He's here," she mouthed. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to open the camera app for the motion feed. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. When the app finally loaded, the living room feed showed nothing. Just the static shot of the door, perfectly still. "Maybe it was the wind," I whispered, though I didn't believe it. Rachel didn't either. And then we heard it again. This time, it was louder, a deliberate creak, like a floorboard under pressure. I glanced at the motion feed again, switching to the bedroom camera. My heart stopped. The bedroom door, which we'd left wide open, was now half closed. Rachel grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "He's inside," she hissed, her voice trembling. I didn't respond. I was too focused on the screen, watching as the bedroom camera feed flickered slightly. A shadow moved across the frame, slow, deliberate. It wasn't much, just a hint of motion in the corner, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, barely able to speak. "Now." Rachel nodded, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. We moved as quietly as we could, tiptoeing toward the front door. I reached for the chair wedged under the knob, but before I could move it, the bottle teetered and fell, shattering on the floor. The noise was deafening in the silence. Behind us, a low, guttural laugh echoed from the bedroom. Rachel screamed, bolting for the door as I yanked the chair away. My fingers fumbled with the locks, panic making them clumsy, and for a horrible second, I thought I wouldn't get it open. But then the bolt slid free, and the door swung wide. We ran into the hallway, slamming the door behind us as we fled. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for air in the cold night. Rachel was shaking so hard she could barely stand, and I had to hold her up as we staggered to the parking lot. My phone was still in my hand, and I realized with a start that it was still recording. I glanced at the screen, dreading what I might see. The feed from the bedroom camera was frozen on the last frame before we'd run. The shadow in the corner had grown larger, more distinct. It wasn't just a blur anymore. It was a person. The police arrived within minutes this time. Rachel and I waited outside while they searched the apartment. When the lead officer came back, his expression was grim. "There's no one inside," he said. "And no sign of forced entry. But you might want to take a look at this." He handed me something in a clear evidence bag. My stomach turned as I recognized it. It was one of the cameras. The one I'd placed in Rachel's bedroom. The lens had been smashed, the casing cracked open like someone had stomped on it. Scribbled across the shattered surface, in that same messy handwriting, were 3 words. "Nice try, Rachel." Whatever sense of safety Rachel had left was gone now. This wasn't just someone playing games. This was personal. He wasn't just following her, he was inside her life, watching her every move. And worst of all, he knew exactly how to stay one step ahead. After that night, Rachel wasn't safe anywhere. Her apartment no longer felt like a haven, it was a playground for someone who seemed to know her every move. She refused to stay there, and I couldn't blame her. Instead, she crashed at my place, bringing little more than a backpack and the haunted look in her eyes. But even at my apartment, the feeling of dread followed us. We couldn't shake the idea that he might still be watching. And then, just as we started to let our guard down, the sixth message arrived. This time, it was on my doorstep. I found it when I stepped out to grab the mail. A plain white envelope, taped to the door at eye level. My name was written on the front in the same scrawled handwriting. For a long moment, I just stared at it, my stomach knotting. I knew what was inside before I even opened it. It was another photo. This one was taken through the window of my living room. The angle showed Rachel and me sitting on the couch the night before, oblivious to the fact that someone was watching us. My blood turned to ice as I realized the time stamp on the photo was from 3 hours ago. He wasn't just following Rachel anymore. He was following me, too. I didn't tell Rachel about the photo right away. She was already so on edge, I didn't want to make it worse. But I knew we couldn't keep running. This guy was relentless, and no matter where we went, he always seemed to find us. That's when I made the decision, we were going to fight back. The next morning, I told Rachel everything. About the photo, the message, all of it. At first, she was furious that I'd kept it from her, but then the anger turned into something else, determination. "I'm done being afraid," she said. "If he wants to play games, fine. Let's end this." We came up with a plan. It was risky, but it was the only way we could think of to draw him out. We needed him to make a mistake. That night, we went back to her apartment. It was the last place either of us wanted to be, but it was the perfect bait. The light stayed off, and we left the door unlocked, just enough to make it seem like she was home but careless. Inside, we waited, hidden in the kitchen with our phones ready to call the cops the moment we heard something. The hours ticked by. Midnight came and went, and I started to wonder if he'd figured us out. But just as my eyelids were growing heavy, there it was, the sound of the door creaking open. Rachel tensed beside me, gripping the knife she'd brought as if her life depended on it. I held up a hand, signaling for her to stay quiet. Footsteps echoed through the apartment, slow and deliberate. He wasn't in a rush. He thought she was alone. The shadow appeared first, stretching across the wall as he moved into the living room. And then, for the first time, we saw him. He wasn't what I expected. Just an average-looking guy in a hoodie and jeans, his face half hidden by the shadow of his hood. But there was something about the way he moved, calm, methodical, like he'd done this 100 times before. He walked to the couch and stopped, standing there for a moment as if savoring the silence. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It caught the faint light from the window as he placed it on the coffee table. It was a key. Rachel gasped, and the sound was enough to shatter the stillness. The man's head snapped up, his eyes locking on ours as we stepped out of the kitchen. For a split second, none of us moved. Then he bolted. We chased him into the hallway, my phone already dialing 911 as Rachel shouted for him to stop. He was fast, but we were determined. By the time he reached the stairwell, we were right behind him. The police arrived within minutes, catching him before he could escape through the back exit. As they hauled him away in handcuffs, Rachel and I stood there, breathing hard, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. It was over. Or so we thought. At the station, the police questioned him for hours. His name was Aaron Pierce, a drifter with no fixed address and a record of petty theft and trespassing. But when it came to Rachel, he was tight-lipped. He wouldn't say how long he'd been watching her, why he'd targeted her, or what his endgame was. All they found in his possession were a few notes, her missing shirt, and the key he'd left on her coffee table. When the officer handed us the key in an evidence bag, Rachel's face went pale. "That's not my key," she said quietly. I frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her hands trembling as she held the bag. "This isn't a key to my apartment. It's a key to my office. The realization hit us both at the same time. He wasn't just watching her at home. He'd been watching her at work, too, waiting, planning, always one step ahead. And as much as we wanted to believe it was over, deep down, we both knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was just another beginning.